Got it. Okay, thank you. I'll keep it short. I'm actually in the Philippines, and I'll come back to the local context later of what we're doing and the challenges we face. But no doubt, as you know, this global food crisis has had a tremendous impact on food prices, on cost of living across the food system. The impact in Asia Pacific, I think, is pretty much similar to many of the other regions. And as with the food crisis in 2007, 2008, among those pushed into hunger in this food crisis include those who produce food. So smaller marginal farmers and the agricultural workers and the agricultural plantation workers and fisherfolk who are our members and who I'm visiting in the Philippines and Malaysia and other countries this month are all facing a tremendous crisis in terms of the cost of food and access to food. I just wanted to make a couple of points to explain a little bit about some of the comments that were made earlier. I think it's important when looking at the ban on the export of wheat from India, there's an important context to remember that, first of all, they're facing massive heat waves with the intensity and frequency of heat waves related to climate change. And they experience severe heat waves across their wheat growing areas at about the time the government announced they would export and make up for the loss of wheat exports from Russia and Ukraine. So that wasn't viable. But also, you may recall that farmers fought for over 1 year in massive mobilizations and protests against the attempts by the government to take away crop support, pricing, crop insurance, and other measures, and reforming agriculture in ways that were detrimental to the interests and rights of farmers and to allow greater corporate encroachment of agriculture. We have to consider that had the government succeeded in pushing that through, we believe we would be in a much, much worse situation in India. And I'll come back to that point because it does relate to civil society. Just on the global front, I think a couple of points that I think are very important in the debate and discussion you're going to have and continue to have is that we talk about these price increases as if it's only because of the war and the shortages and the demand and the logistics and the access. But actually the prices increased for wheat, for example, 23% before the war. And there was massive speculation for the 2 weeks leading up to that. And as we saw in 2007, 2008 global food crisis, financial speculators, banks, financial institutions, investment funds, financial institutions not normally involved in agriculture became heavily involved in speculating. And that exacerbated the crisis. It created more volatility, but also raised prices and pushed people into poverty and hunger. That hasn't changed. Even though the EU directive on markets in financial instruments was amended in 2014 to take that into account, with similar reforms in legislation in the US, there was a massive fight back by various financial institutions, including Deutsche Bank, to prevent the regulation of this. And as we sit here today, we must remember that as the war is raging, as we face food shortages and inflation, they are making huge profits. All of these investment firms, banks, financial institutions that are speculating in agricultural commodity markets are absolutely doing extremely well. It's on their websites. They're very proud of it. The French wheat futures market, 70% of all trading currently is speculative and nothing to do with traditional grain handlers. In the weeks leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it tripled, and they continue to speculate, and that adds to the volatility. So although the prices have dropped down in those futures markets, it's still very volatile. And then they started speculating in all of the crops that might replace wheat, and then all of the crops that might replace edible oils, the sunflower. And that's partly why the prices are being driven up. And my point there, I think, is very simple. There's a massive disconnect between real markets of agricultural commodities, physical markets, and prices. And that disconnect is through this financial speculation. I differentiate between hedging, which is traditionally very important in agricultural commodity markets, hedging by grain handlers. It's important for reducing risk for farmers. It's different. We're talking about pure speculation. And nothing has been done since the 2008 crisis about derivatives and other financial instruments which classify food and nutrition, agricultural produce as an asset class only. This investment contributes nothing to the world food system. It contributes nothing to farmers and to consumers. It is purely speculative. And whatever happens going forward, whatever debate you have, this needs to be addressed. Certain kinds of derivatives and financial instruments must be banned. The discussion was had, 2014 amendments were made, it was watered down, and nothing's happened. And I think that this current crisis proves how serious that is. The second point about the global situation, very quickly, is that while we talk about the concentration of countries and dependent on countries, it's important to remember that 4 companies, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Dreyfus, those 4 companies, they manage 70 to 80% of all of the grain trade in the world, of the global grain trade. 4 companies. They're called ABCD, sorry. And it's important also to understand that the entire infrastructure in Russia around wheat, with all of the mills and the infrastructure and the extensive networks that were built by these companies, is part of that. So the concentration isn't natural. It's not natural that they're producing all of this wheat. It is planned. It's a division of labor established by certain corporations that dominate the world grain market. And in all of the discussion in the past few months, they've never been really mentioned. And they're absolutely, again, if you look at their share prices and look at their results, they're doing massively well. They will do well with an increase in exports, and they'll do well in a crisis. And even as the business press has said, when it comes to war and hunger, they do particularly well. So I do think it's worth looking at those companies and what role they play. I don't think we can avoid that and just have a conversation about governments, regulation, markets, and opportunities. This is not about the free function of markets. It's not about farmers selling produce on markets and consumers buying it. It's about the manipulation of markets and that disconnect. Then on the local front, very quickly, 2 things. I'm here in the Philippines, basically supposed to be working with our members in agriculture, farms, and fisherfolk on the impact of climate change and our adaptation and survival in the face of that. As you know, due to rising heat and extreme heat events, we're losing more and more safe working hours in a day and being able to produce less and work less in a day. In 2020, globally, 295 billion potential working hours were lost in outdoor work, 70% of which was in agriculture. We have lost in Asia Pacific, in Southeast Asia and South Asia region, on average 2.5 hours a day is lost now. The number of safe working hours is diminished and continues to reduce, and extreme heat events are increasing. So we're trying to respond to that. How can we adapt? And unfortunately, our members, small marginal farmers, agricultural workers, plantation workers, have reached the limit of their adaptive capacity. They work from 3 a.m. in the cool hours. They work into the night. They do not work in the middle of the day anymore because of the extreme heat. This is the adaptation. But they're more exposed to malaria, dengue, and other diseases at night, and we struggle. But my work with the fisherfolk, I want to give you as an example, is that here are people that fish for a living. They have their own small vessels, less than 12 meters, small-scale fishing communities. They have been badly hit by this food crisis because of the price of cooking oil and other foodstuffs, are in a severe situation. Increased extreme weather events prevents them fishing more often, and encouragement of large-scale commercial fishing for export to the EU has also stolen much of their livelihood. And we're really working with this. I wanted to come back to this question about women and the support there. Look, the instruments exist, and we need your support. The FAO voluntary guidelines on securing small-scale fisheries for food security and eradication of poverty has a very important gender component about women's right to land and tenure and access to aquatic resources, and the right for women to manage those resources in the community. This is a voluntary guidelines, and we need help to legislate it. We think this would be a very important strategy to ensuring food security in our region, but also in the whole debate about protein. Understand that aquatic food sources are an important source of protein in certain parts of the world, and we can actually address food security and nutrition through aquatic sources, but through small-scale fishing, not large-scale commercial fishing exported to Europe, which is actually depriving these communities of food and nutrition. So I just wanted to mention that as well. I apologize for going over time, but these are some of the aspects. I do think that we can work together on it, but a more coherent strategy needs to understand, finally, that for civil society to have a role, we need civic space, we need democratic space. Our farmer leaders, one of them was just arrested in Myanmar. He's sentenced to 20 years in prison and by the military regime. He was just picked up after successfully hiding for nearly a year. And he is basically a trainer in sustainable agriculture and reducing pesticides. And he will serve between 7 and 20 years once he's sentenced. We cannot have sustainable agriculture, the right to food and food security, if we don't have the democratic space, the civic space. Without civic space, we don't have the civil society. Thank you.
Moving on to Mr. Greenfield, please. Can I invite you to reflect on this debate and also the role of civil society? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll answer a couple of the questions. I just wanted to clarify. I think that I wasn't talking about just speculation on prices and the ban on palm oil or speculation, not at all. What I'm talking about is the speculation prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that there would be a crisis, that wheat, maize, and sunflower oil would be drastically hit in terms of supply, but there would actually be suffering. So you speculate and you bet on hunger. And that's what the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights said. These speculators are betting on hunger. And I think that we have to draw a line and say that is unethical, immoral, and unacceptable. And I don't think it's that complicated, even though in the EU you've debated this for 14 years and not legislated or taken action at all about this. I think it's simple. There are financial institutions with instruments like derivatives that contribute nothing to the production of food, contribute nothing to the food system, don't support farmers, they don't provide them with any hedging for the future, they don't provide insurance, and they don't help consumers. What on earth do they do? It's very simple. Draw a line. They're insurance companies, yes. The grain handlers, yes. All sorts of financial companies, agricultural banks, cooperative banks, yes, we have them. Cooperative bank members in agriculture are our union members. At the end of the day, there are these financial instruments created by banks and the same institutions that turn toxic housing debts in the US into profit. When debt becomes profit, and what they've done, and look at the derivatives, there are derivatives that already include the debt that Russian farmers and Ukrainian farmers, mix them both, forget the war, they include the debt that these people will have in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. They've already included that in their derivatives. It's chopped up, mixed up, and sold as a product. It's a financial product. It's the responsibility of all governments to look at these financial products and determine whether they do harm or whether they contribute at all economically and socially. I'm sorry to be very strong about it, but it's been going on for 14 years, and everyone spoke about this much better than I did in 2000, 2008, and a lot of good policy research and proposals. And the lobbying group for these financial organizations, these institutes have done so well to demolish that. And in fact, when this legislation was proposed, some very good legislation in the US to ban certain kinds of derivatives, Deutsche Bank was one of the financial institutions that joined a lobbying group to stop that legislation. That's a fact. So please look at that, and please look at how the Paris wheat exchange, which is a very important wheat exchange for farmers in Europe, is being manipulated. 70% of all trades being manipulated that have nothing to do with the supply or the availability of wheat. I think it's outrageous. In terms of the palm oil ban in Indonesia, not Malaysia, so Indonesia has continued to ban the export of palm oil. The context is that palm oil is the main source of cooking oil for the Indonesian population of 270 million people. They forced people off kerosene gas cookers some 15 years ago. And all sorts of things, all sorts of changes, energy use. When it came to cooking oil, it all shifted to palm oil. The fact is today, everyone is dependent on palm oil. and the price of palm oil within Indonesia, as the largest producer in the world, has doubled, and it's rationed. If you go to the supermarket, you're only allowed to buy 1 liter or 1.5 liters per customer. It's rationed. So there's rationing, there's restrictions. Because of that, there's a strong risk for the government of social unrest and a political response, and the government has an election in 2024. So I think it's just, and by the way, a third of sitting parliamentarians own palm oil plantations in some form or another. They own other things, they own airlines and other things, but a third of parliamentarians have an interest in palm oil companies and plantations, so maybe they're hedging as well. But at the end of the day, they will lift the ban on palm oil exports. But what's happened is everything's had a flow-on effect. So palm oil prices were too high because palm oil was being used to replace sunflower oil because it wasn't coming out of the Ukraine. And then soybean oil and so on, and it's had this flow-on effect, and then the biofuel demand. I think the connectedness of this is a challenge for us, and what we have to do, I don't support the ban on any export of any agricultural commodity, but we need to reassess its purpose, and we need to give priority to the food use of those, because I think that using palm oil for biofuel at this time in a food crisis is going to be a real challenge. And I have a meeting with the palm oil companies in Malaysia, I think on Monday, and with our plantation members who are also in crisis and facing a food crisis themselves. So it's a difficult situation. I do think the Indonesian government will eventually lift the ban, but they'll reimpose the ban by September. Food prices will go through the roof. I think the recession's already begun for us. So I think they'll lift the ban maybe end of July, reimpose it in September. There'll be more outrage. I should say, though, you might recall that 7-8 years ago in Europe, you were debating banning palm oil imports. And there was a big debate about how people don't want to use palm oil in their products. So there's a little bit of confusion, not by me, but in Indonesia about that criticism now that there's this ban. But it really shows the interdependency, and it shows how a lot of the edible oils, because they're locked into biofuels as one single market, as an oil market, I think it's going to be very challenging. But if you could just understand, I think at the end of the day, it's everyone's basic cooking oil, and it's doubled in price, and it's tough times. And they'll lift the ban, reimpose it, and then see what Malaysia does. I hope that answers it. Thank you.